All right, well, welcome everybody to the next installment of our Real Spirituality screening series. And I'm really delighted to be talking today with Steve James, who is the director of the new Nat Geo docuseries called City So Real. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation.
Great to be here.
Yeah. Your documentary premiered at Sundance last year. And generally I go out each year and we have a class there and I get to see them. And it's always so frustrating to be a part of the documentary films because you see the first couple episodes and then you walk away going, what happened? And then there's always this delay of when you actually get to see them. So it's great that this is about to come out and premiere on Nat Geo. And what struck me both in terms of watching some of the emergence of the new kind of docuseries format and then yours in particular at a time like this is, you know, everyone's acknowledging we live in this kind of post-truth era. And one of the victims of that, I think this is just my sort of read of the situation, is one of the victims is journalism and calling into question, you know, some of the people that we would have known as sort of the truth tellers of society. So I wondered, as I watch your series and others, I wonder if maybe you could comment on whether or not this sort of long form documentary filmmaking is kind of the new journalism. And if not, how would you understand your role as a documentary filmmaker in relationship to the broader society and even the individuals that you're documenting?
Yeah, wow, that's great questions. Yeah, I mean, I think there is, you know, the docuseries is very much with us now. It's interesting because it really took off with crime dramas. I mean, crime docuseries, and they're still very popular. There's still quite a few of those made, and I could see the appeal of those because you had a kind of built-in drama. You could, depending on how you cut it together, you could have these kind of cliffhangers to keep people, doing the equivalent of a page turner, novel. And there's been quite a few good ones of that. But I think one of the things that's exciting to me is that in the last year or so, a couple of years at least, it's really it's expanded. The docuseries now is really a long form journalism and long form filmmaking that allows you to really sort of immerse and sink yourself into stories that just, you can't really do justice in a 90-minute documentary. I mean, I've been making long films my whole career. Somebody might sarcastically say I've been making docuseries, but just calling them movies. But this form really fits for me because it really does allow for that kind of more, even epic kind of approach, but at the same time without the loss of intimacy and nuance and detail.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that's a good way of describing the feel of this series, because we're kind of enamored with, let's say, national level politics, and get so sort of caught up in that, and yet politics really is like a fiercely local happening. And so that's really interesting. National politics kind of impinges in some moments in the story, but it's a really fiercely local story you're telling. What was important to you about that sort of locality of that story?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think, for most people, local politics is where they most regularly and frequently feel the impact of politics in their life and of political decisions and government in their life. And so, and I think that local politics is also, in many respects, for those that are really engaged, it's the most passionate form of political engagement that our country has. Now, I realize we're in the middle of a national election where there's a lot of strong passions. But I think typically on the local level is where you really see that the most. And there's no place where that's more true than Chicago. I mean, Chicago is known as a political town. It's known as a rough and tumble political town. One of the operatives in the series at one point calls it politics of blood sport. in Chicago, and I think that's an accurate description. So I was also fascinated with just showing what it was about Chicago's politics that make it so unique and so passionate and so important to this town. And so that was a big part of my desire in wanting to follow the mayoral election.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me as, an outsider who lives in another sort of dense, highly populous area. But, Chicago is a bit more of a caricature, I think, in my mind, as someone who doesn't live there. And so most of what I know about local politics and whatnot is, obviously it's skewed, but it does seem to be more sensationalized than real. And so
Yeah.
part of what was helpful about this was that more intimate kind of connection of on the ground was really sort of eye-opening, really, of saying, like, what's really going on in Chicago, and why does it become the sort of poster child for so many talking points out there. What I also thought was interesting was, and again, for how it's being distributed, it makes sense, but it opens, interestingly, with a disturbing content warning. And rightly so. I mean, it makes sense in terms of some of the stuff that you're going over, but you certainly aren't artificially inflating anything for like dramatic effect. But my sense is, so it'd be interesting to hear if you think this is right or not, that part of the final product you have here is you're wanting us as viewers to really look hard at what's happening here and not look away, and to be disturbed because many of these realities are in fact disturbing. If you know the adage from, again, a journalism adage that came up a while back of afflicting the comforted and comforting the afflicted, right? That sort of comes to mind. But from your sort of filmmaking approach and in your past doing more sort of the cinema verite observational stuff, with this project, are you pursuing a kind of thesis, or do you see this as kind of a piece of pure observational cinema, or is it some mix of the two?
Yeah, I certainly don't see it as pure observational cinema. In fact, even in my more completely verite work, I don't think of myself as a purely observational filmmaker. I think of Frederick Wiseman as sort of the epitome of that, and he's brilliant at it. I like to engage with people. I'm not. Yes, I do. We do shoot scenes where we are the proverbial fly on the wall and we're not engaging with people, and that happens a lot. But it's not a rule. And oftentimes I will engage with people and talk to people and try to draw them out. And sometimes, like in this series, that kind of back and forth is much more included because it felt like what I was trying to do was to have a conversation and not go in with preconceived thesis or ideas about that this is what we're going to find. I mean, I tend to try to not take that approach generally. Whatever I think I'm going to find, and however smart I think I am about a topic going into it, and there have been times, I must confess, where I think, I know a lot about this. I usually find out fairly quickly how little I know. Yeah. And I'm humble enough, I think, to recognize that and embrace that. And so I think of City So Real as one kind of long, messy, crazy, funny, serious conversation with the people of Chicago, some of whom are candidates for mayor, and many of whom are not.
It's interesting. In my teaching, when I'm talking to students who are writing papers, I say you start off with a general idea, direction, and I was like, but if at the end of writing this, it is exactly what you imagined it would be from the start, that's going to be one of the most boring papers I've ever read. It's got to emerge along the way as that sort of conversation.
And it would be, it's almost like, I mean, other than to get a grade in that case, what's the point?
Exactly.
What's the point of even doing it if you're not really going to learn anything? It's amazing though, sometimes, I'm not going to name titles, but it's amazing sometimes how I'll see films where I feel like the filmmaker has really kind of decided in advance what they believe is the truth here and what's important here. And sometimes you see these films and you see a much more interesting film trying to come out and surface, but the filmmaker is determined to keep it in a box. And that's really unfortunate.
Oh man. Well, speaking of not being able to keep things in a box and going into this sort of conversational approach, one scene that's still just, and it's actually sort of two parallel scenes of the barbershops. And I wonder if you could, especially where you've got the postal worker who's the customer, could you maybe just describe to us that moment in that barbershop and what you're thinking as a filmmaker as this conversation is unfolding? And I don't know how much was prompted or not, but what's taking place in terms of how you're capturing that, and then what you're thinking about of the actual dialogue, this conversation these two people are having that's really passionate, heated, intense, and then ends with a high fade, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's one of my favorites too. That one and the white barbershop that follows as a pair. You know, when we went there with this. This is a perfect example of going in with a certain idea of what we were going to do, which was that was the barbershop where this barber who had been killed in an altercation with the cops named Harith Augustus had worked. And after that incident with the cops and everything had kind of faded, I thought it'd be great to go back to the barbershop when everything had calmed down and just get them to talk a little bit about who this guy was. You know, who was Harith Augustus? That was the original idea. I thought it was a pretty good idea to go in, right? So we went in, and you don't see this in the series, but they talked a little bit about Harith, and it was okay. And then the postal worker wandered in, and he had never been in that barbershop before, clearly. And he then began to engage with the guys in the shop, and one barber in particular, in this passionate argument about who qualifies as being privileged in their community, not white privilege, although white privilege hovers over this entire series as well as this scene. And I'm there, and I'm just amazed by this conversation because it's so apart from my own peer experience as a person growing up, and my life, my socioeconomic position in this world, that I'm amazed by this conversation. And I'm even kind of more amazed at how heated it got. And I started to worry about how heated it was getting and starting to feel responsible, not because we had encouraged this conversation, it happened, but because us being there had in some way obviously contributed to the whole thing. But then it was funny because then it kind of died down, as you see in the scene. And this is not in the series, but at one point I said to the guys, I said, well, I just want to say something to all you guys. From my vantage point, none of you have privilege. You're all self-made men who have battled a lot to get where you are. And it was funny, they all kind of sat there and paused for a second, then they went, oh, thanks. And it was like, shoo. But then they went on to, cut the postal worker's hair. And it's a thing that I've come to discover about the Black barbershop experience is that is not true, I think, in a white barbershop, which is, first, you can have that kind of heated, very political conversation, and then people can go on and be friendly, and the animosity or the tension is gone.
In my sphere, I work with a lot of folks that are either in or are planning, training, going into some sort of leadership role in a religious community, specifically in some sort of Christian church or nonprofit or something like that. And in a sort of parallel way, that sort of white normativity hovers over all of these proceedings in the barbershop, et cetera. It also hovers over this other sort of social gathering point known as churches in the United States.
Yes.
And the church pops up now and again in the series. But I wonder if you had any thoughts as you're kind of observing specifically religious leaders, church organizations, um, as you're watching, maybe it's specifically in Chicago, but then maybe you could reflect more broadly of how they are maybe complicit in those sort of structures, and then maybe some places you saw like, oh, here are some opportunities where church leaders, church groups, religious communities might actually leverage this moment in some constructive or life-giving ways. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's interesting in the series, the most prominent place that churches show up is when Willie Wilson, the self-made millionaire candidate, does what we came to jokingly refer to as his church crawl, where he went to several churches and apparently in defiance of the whole notion of the separation of church and state, he handed out he handed out donations. But here's the thing about Willie. Willie does that anyway.
Yeah.
Even if he's not running for office, he is that kind of guy. He's a very religious man himself, and he does a lot of giving back to community. And for that, the Black community in particular is particularly appreciative of that. It's well known in that community because he walks the walk. We shot another scene that didn't make it into the film, and it would have been a really nice scene to have in the film at a different church, and where the Bible class was having a conversation about the Laquan McDonald trial. This for people who haven't seen the series and might be listening in here is right. This is the young Black man who was killed by a Chicago police officer. And the trial is featured in the series. And that was an incredible conversation. You're probably saying, why isn't that in the series? I don't have a good answer, but it was an incredible conversation, very memorable, because the pastor who led the class really asked challenging questions of his congregation and encouraged a really provocative conversation. And my experience, I grew up in the Methodist church in my youth, and my experience of the church I grew up in is that something like that never would have happened. That it just wouldn't have happened. That wasn't what church was for. And so I think in the Black community especially, it is the political consciousness and the engagement with social issues is a profound part of the experience of the church as to what I've witnessed. And I think that's great and vitally important.
Yeah, to me, it offers some just helpful touch points, concrete examples of how to kind of walk into it. And that's what I was thinking, that the barbershop parallel, right, of the Black barbershop, white barbershop is a really, almost one-to-one comparison to the Black church, white church. You have a group that simply could not and would not imagine doing otherwise, and then a group that has the ability and privilege to just kind of ignore it as a conversation. And yet my sense is that these communities have an opportunity right now in the sort of current moment of racial, social, all the sort of reckonings we're going through, to do something, to draw on some resources that we've got that should be able to move the needle in some way. If only we had the courage of our convictions, I think is part of it.
Well, can I make one
please.
quick point? There's a festival which you should, if you haven't gone to, you should make a point of going to when it's possible to go to festivals. Have you been to the True False Film Festival?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
You have been there.
Uh-huh.
So about their program they have there that they do with a large, I think it's a mega church, but it's not mega church in the way that at least a lot of liberal people think of mega church. And they have this incredible program there of engagement with the film festival and the church, and they pick films that are very provocative, but about social issues, and they have a great sort of collaborative process and conversation around that. A film I did there years ago called The Interrupters was selected for it, and we got to speak in the church and have those kind of conversations, which I thought was great.
Yeah, and it's part of what why I engage film and think about it, because it does allow for that sort of the common object that we can talk about and around in some really helpful ways, that otherwise we really struggle with. And maybe a sort of another connecting point to that is my thoughts about how this specific series functions in society, right? So this is maybe more on the kind of reception oriented side of things, but it really struck me at the end of episode 1, I think, basically ends with a local Chicago DJ and his segment. It appeared that it was the end of one of his segments, or maybe his show for the day, ends with the 16 gunshots, ringing out, and it's intense, it's brutal, fade to black, and that's the sort of intentional disturbing moment that was really effective. And it called to mind some of the other kind of protest movements and things that would do something like have people, be in a moment of silence for 8 minutes and 46 seconds for George Floyd, or these other things that really underscore the sort of profound length of time, intentionality. I mean, like it just really drives it home. And what it also connected to my mind is it's an old African American spiritual. Were you there? I don't know if you're familiar with this song. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? And the end of each stanza ends with, it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. And from what I understand of the history of that song, when enslaved groups were singing that, they would say tremble. The number of times that they would repeat that at the end of each stanza reflected how many of their fellow slaves had been lynched the day before. It was this sort of public confession, lament, and remembering of what happened, right? We're trying to remember that. So I wonder if you think in these terms with your film, and maybe now that it's done, you can separate yourself from it in some ways. That is what it felt like at the end of that episode, those shots ringing out, that it was a kind of functioning as a contemporary spiritual, if you will, remembering these events, these horrors, these acts, not to just dwell on something we couldn't do anything about, but somehow breathing life into this in a way that kind of draws upon the best of our community, but then also causes us again to stare at the face of horror and do something about it. Is that a fair way of thinking about that episode or the thing as a whole?
Well, I love those thoughts on it. And I guess what I would say is that as a filmmaker, I consider my highest calling, if you will, is to present the world in a way that encourages viewers to think about it and not spring to easy judgments. Because you're dealing with in my case, you're dealing with real people up on the screen. And the easiest thing to do is for an audience member to sit there, whether it's in a dark theater or on your couch in the living room, and be judgmental about what you're watching. And so I take it as a vitally important part of my role is to do what I can to discourage that and to instead encourage understanding. And that doesn't mean making it Pollyanna. It doesn't mean soft pedaling. It means through juxtaposition, through the editing, through the choices we make, getting you to really think about what you're watching. One of the things I love about that scene at the end of Maze is that the Laquan McDonald trial was, and it's in the series, and then beyond the series, obviously, in so many ways, it had generated a lot of conversation and a lot of strong feelings. And when Maze Jackson, the DJ, when he plays those 16 shots without commentary, it's one of those moments, I think, that catches you up and makes you really think about what happened versus rushing to an opinion or a judgment about what happened.
Ooh, well, it's certainly effective, and so it'll be really interesting as it releases, especially this first episode, what kind of conversation it generates. Along those lines, I usually ask, and you kind of answered it already, actually, of like, here's my calling as a filmmaker. But if you were going to say, I've sort of, it's the same question, but opposite directions. As you've kind of now spent time both as a person in Chicago, but then now making this film, and you think about either local politics and issues that are going there, and then how they, embody everything that nationally we're dealing with too. After walking through this, my two-sided question is, one, what would you say grieves you the most? And then the reverse would be, now having walked through this, what are those places where you feel like you have hope?
Boy, you don't ask the easy ones, do you?
No.
Well, I think what probably grieves me the most, I mean, there's many things to be aggrieved about in some ways. I think the thing that I probably grieve the most in Chicago is that the profoundly different futures one has here depending on where you're born and the circumstance to which you're born in. And that reverberates out. It reverberates out into whether you're in a neighborhood that's more violent. It reverberates out into what kind of school you go to. It reverberates out in so many directions, what kind of job you can possibly get. But it's, a lot of times I think white people of goodwill will look at Black people who have pulled themselves out of such dire circumstances and become successful. And in celebrating them, they will say, see what you can do? And they don't often stop to think about the fact that that's an extraordinary person that's able to do that. And that most of us nice white people in that same situation wouldn't be one of them either. We wouldn't be one of those extraordinary people that is able to overcome so much. And so I think that's probably what grieves me the most. And I think what gives me the most hope here is probably that this is a city of passionate people. It's the birthplace of community organizing in America. It's a place where people do not uniformly just take what's given to them and say, okay, I'm fine with that. They stand up for themselves and they make demands. And so a lot of what's going on around the country now in the wake of George Floyd is very much a part of the DNA of Chicago and has been for a very long time. And that gives me hope.
Wonderful. I really appreciated the series. I really hope it is a success and received well. Again, it is City So Real, and you've been listening to the director, Steve James. Steve, thanks so much for chatting with me, and good luck with this series as it launches and as people start watching it, and then hopefully having some real conversations about it as well.
Appreciate it. Enjoyed talking with you very much. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.